Hello and welcome back to International School History Teacher. Is Donald Trump's USA a fascist state? Sorry about the clickbait title, and let me save you the trouble of watching the rest of the film. No, it isn't. Or at least it wasn't at the moment this film was made. But the fact that it now seems reasonable to ask the fascism question tells us something I think is very important. Now, I've been teaching this nonsense for over 30 years, and we certainly haven't seen anything like this before. So this film does not argue that the US is already an authoritarian neo-fascist state, nor does it claim that American democracy has already collapsed. Instead, it applies the same analytical tools I've used to study historical authoritarianism in my previous films, and applies them to the USA today. Now, these tools come from comparative history, sociology, political science in general. Academics in these areas do not identify authoritarianism by slogans and personalities, but by recurring patterns in how power is acquired, consolidated, and exploited over time. Now, when these patterns do appear, even partially, history tells us to pay attention. If you ask students why they should study history, they often repeat a familiar cliché about not wanting to repeat the mistakes of the past. But history is not a warning label. It is a diagnostic tool. It helps us recognize when systems are under strain, when norms are eroding, and when moments that once seemed unthinkable begin to feel normal. This film is an attempt to do exactly that. It's the spring of 2026, 1 year more or less into the second Trump presidency. And events that would have once seemed implausible have entered the realms of political reality. In recent months, the US has carried out extraterritorial detention, kidnapping of a foreign head of state. The president has threatened Democratic allies with punitive trade measures whilst threatening to invade Greenland, with Canada apparently also on the horizon. Within the US itself, heavily armed, masked federal agents have appeared on the streets of American cities. American citizens have been killed. And serious commentators, legal scholars, journalists, former officials, well, they've begun to reach for this sort of historical language normally avoided in such public debate. They've made comparisons with the SA in interwar Germany and the Gestapo-like methods being employed and increasingly used in American cities. We even find the use of the F word. And this is not simply used as an insult. This is an historically informed question about where America is going. Only this week, the French President Emmanuel Macron warned that the world is entering what he called
a shift towards autocracy against democracy, more violence.
There was little ambiguity about where that warning was directed.
An absolute record.
Now, as in my earlier films, this film is also organised into 3 sections. The first section deals with the emergence. How far did Donald Trump's ascent resemble the typical pathways through which authoritarian leaders come to office? Secondly, consolidation. An assessment of how close the United States has moved towards authoritarian patterns of rule. And finally, ideology. But also ideology with policy and rule. A consideration on what Trump is doing in practice and how far comparisons with 20th century authoritarian states are illuminating, misleading, or even just premature. This is not really a film about what America is. It is a film in 3 acts about what it may be becoming, and what would still have to happen for history's darkest comparisons to cease being mere warnings. When historians analyse the rise of authoritarian leaders, they distinguish between structure and agency. Structure concerns the political, the economic, the social, and the cultural conditions that shape what kinds of leadership become possible and even acceptable. Agency concerns individual historical actors and their choices. Now, both matter, but history suggests that structure matters more. From Weimar Germany to fascist Italy, authoritarian leaders succeeded not because they were uniquely persuasive, but because democratic systems had lost legitimacy in the eyes of the elites and the voters alike. In interwar Europe, figures like Hitler and Benito Mussolini entered government through legal or semi-legal means when parliamentary democracy had lost legitimacy. The decisive issue was not how they came to power, the coup, the march, the emergency decree. What was important was why voters and elites were willing to support them. Now that same structural logic applies to the US today.
The Nazi leader poses with his cabinet, which includes von Papen, seated on his left, who is now Vice-Chancellor.
Politically, the US faces a legitimation crisis defined by declining public trust in institutions. Confidence in Congress, the judiciary, and the presidency has plummeted. Electoral integrity has been repeatedly challenged, especially after the 2020 election, with a significant portion of the population believing it was stolen.
By the way, 82% of the country understands that it was a rigged election, okay? You can't have a country with that.
Economically, growing inequality and precarity have left large swathes of the population feeling abandoned. The richest 1% of Americans now has more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. The only other country with similarly high levels of wealth concentration is Russia, an authoritarian oligarchy. The collapse of trade union power, stagnating wages, skyrocketing living costs have all contributed to the appeal of populist rhetoric that blames globalism and scapegoats immigrants or liberal elites.
They are drug dealers and they are criminals. They're gang members, killers and rapists. And I mean, they're coming into this country.
Authoritarian states are always very good at blaming minority groups.
The goal of Nazi propaganda was to demonize Jews and encourage Germans to see Jews as dangerous outsiders in their midst.
Socially, the US is now starkly divided along racial, religious and urban-rural lines. The rise of political violence, hate crimes and militia activity reflects a breakdown of shared civic identity. When trust between groups erodes, citizens become more likely to accept authoritarian measures as necessary to restore order. Culturally, social media and cable news have fragmented the public sphere, replacing informed discourse with echo chambers, conspiracy thinking and literal culture wars.
Look at how you act, and your children are watching.
Here in Nashville, they threw books like Harry Potter and Twilight into the fire.
Now, Donald Trump has expressed political ambitions for decades.
Most hurt.
For most of that time, he was not taken seriously. An earlier ascent to power would have been unthinkable.
Maybe I'd run for president. I don't know.
What changed was not Trump's character, but the conditions that made his style of leadership resonate. Trump did not create this crisis, he exploited it. Long before holding office, he normalized coercive rhetoric, encouraging violence at rallies.
Knock the crap out of him. Like to punch him in the face. Boom, 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 I'll beat that.
Praising authoritarian leaders and treating legal limits as negotiable.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
His authority rested less on policy than on performance. By bypassing traditional media and communicating directly through social media and rallies, Trump fused politics with spectacle.
Events in Washington have taken a violent and tumultuous turn in the past few hours, as thousands of supporters of President Trump stormed the US Capitol building.
The decisive breach came in January 2021 when Donald Trump mobilized his supporters against the certification of the presidential election. In January 2026, former special counsel Jack Smith testified to a committee of Congress, his conclusion being that
rather than accept his defeat in the 2020 election, President Trump engaged in a criminal scheme to overturn the results and prevent the lawful transfer of power.
That this act did not end his political career and was instead followed by an electoral return, transformed a failed challenge to democracy into a precedent, signalling that attempts to overturn outcomes could be survived and even rewarded. And on the horizon are the November midterm elections, which polling suggests Trump is going to lose.
Reason for his concern. Democrats have a clear advantage.
Again, former Special Counsel Jack Smith warns of catastrophic threats to democracy in his testimony on Capitol Hill.
Is that we have seen the rule of law function in our country for so long that many of us have come to take it for granted.
So Donald Trump's emergence does not resemble the stereotypical seizure of power by an authoritarian, the coup, the revolution and the putsch. But it does resemble a familiar historical pattern. A leader elevated through democratic means because a democratic state is widely perceived as failing across political, economic, social and cultural dimensions. That structural vulnerability, more than the individual ambition, is the foundation of the current authoritarian risk.
All you fascists are bound to lose. You fascists are bound to lose. All you fascists are bound to lose. You fascists are bound to lose.